and research data service at the University of Michigan Library, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's sessions. Today's presentations are the second in a series of 8 presentations hosted by the Michigan Institute for Data Science, or MIDAS, showcasing the work being done on research reproducibility issues at the University of Michigan. Each of these presentations was submitted as an entry in the MIDAS Reproducibility Challenge, which took place earlier this year. The series will run through the summer and culminate in a day-long summit on issues of reproducibility in research on September 14th, 2020. We're very much hoping that the MIDAS Reproducibility Day will be an in-person and interactive event. Please keep an eye out for more information throughout the summer. In developing the MIDAS Reproducibility Challenge, we sought to highlight the high-quality work on or relating to research reproducibility happening at the University of Michigan. And as in many emerging areas, there are multiple definitions for what constitutes research reproducibility. We adopted the broad definition provided by the National Academy's Committee on Reproducibility and Replicability in Science. They define computational reproducibility as obtaining consistent computational results using same input data, computational steps, methods, codes, and the conditions of analysis. Today, we'll hear 2 presentations. Our first presentation will be from Jake Fisher, research investigator at the Survey Research Center and the Institute for Social Research. In his presentation entitled Data-Specific Functions, Jake will describe a strategy for data collection efforts through distributing an open source set of tools for working with a particular data set. And I'll also show an example of how he's applied such a strategy in his work. Jake, go ahead.
Well, thanks. Thanks, Jake. Thanks for having me on. It's really a pleasure to get to present this for you. And I'm looking forward to hearing everybody's thoughts and questions about this project. I need to actually share screen with you. There we go. So as Jake mentioned, this project is looking at basically a strategy for designing functions to perform common recoding tasks with data. And so normally, I'm in the Survey Research Center, unsurprisingly do a lot of work with survey data. And to give you an idea of why I felt like this would be a valuable contribution, I think it helps to look at how survey data are typically distributed, both a good case and a bad case. So we're starting with a good case. Let's see if we can get this working. There we go. Starting with a good case, the American Time Use Survey is distributed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so when you go, they've got a whole website, they've got a ton of documentation for it. When you go on their website, you can click through the documentation and you can see that there's 7 to 10 different links to give you documentation. And if you click one of those links, like the data dictionary, you'll get a page. This is part of the page, but it'll be hundreds of links to PDF files. Most of the PDF files are about 60 to 70 pages long with about 5 appendices. So there's an awful lot of stuff to read when you first encounter a well-documented and excellent survey data resource. Now this is the best case scenario. A more typical case, I think, well, maybe not more typical case, but certainly a case when when individual investigators collect their own survey data and you're brought on as a graduate student, for example, you tend to encounter something like this. So this is screenshots of a box folder of a survey that I used extensively throughout grad school called the Prosper Survey. And so this was a longitudinal survey of students in schools. But as you can see, basically when you request access to these data, they give you access to the box. They basically make you an editor on the box folder, and they're like, good luck. And so there's, I think I counted 637 files in this folder. All of their names are totally incomprehensible. So we have ind main data with a bunch of mysterious dates. God knows what those are. We have group individual level characteristics. I think that's what that group indlev means. We've got hundreds of little network files in SAS and then also stored in different data formats. So it's just a hot mess. And looking at this, you might say, oh, hey, look, there's a folder that says Prosper Codebooks. But if you actually click on that folder, you'll see that there's 27 Word documents, all of which are kind of ill-documented, none of which actually cover the entire survey, including 3 different Excel files for the different dates of the survey. And it's okay, I hope the last one is the most recent, but I'm not positive that it actually is. So I think this is actually somewhat common for survey documentation. And so I was trying to think of a better way to deal with this. And one of the guiding principles here in designing this is that I think if we're being honest with ourselves, lots of people have a tendency not to read documentation. So we remember this whenever we get a piece of IKEA furniture and we start trying to assemble it by hand, and then we're like, oh shoot, and then we go back and like to actually look at the documents, but we conveniently forget it when we're distributing data for other people. We hope that they will sit and spend like 5 days reading the entire documentation, when in fact they probably start working with the data and then ultimately go back and kind of fill in gaps in their knowledge with the documentation. Even with that documentation, there still tends to be a lot of tacit knowledge that kind of comes with the data. These are things that we don't necessarily put in the documentation, but that people who work with the data often know. So again, to take this example of students in the schools, one of the schools caught fire and burned down. And so people analyzing those data have a tendency to drop that school very consistent, like they almost always drop that school. But there's no way you would know that from any of the code books or any of the 637 files. You just have to know to drop that particular school. Or because it's a longitudinal survey of kids in schools, sometimes they get held back. And so you need to when you're merging data, you need to make sure that you merge on wave or an ID and cohort, because otherwise you'll get the same kid twice in 2 different waves or something like that. And this seems to crop up in virtually every data analysis example. Like, oh, if we reported on several people in the household, oh, we typically only use the main respondent. If you're like trying to calculate wealth in a survey, like, oh yeah, there's like these 27 variables and we usually use so-and-so's code to do that. And basically, if you're not in the know, you would kind of be lost to do this. And so, one of the, this came about when I was reviewing a paper that had suggested constructing a table of metadata about like a regular expression parsable table of metadata about the survey file for the Fragile Families Challenge. And so it's like, basically instead of having a regular code book, they would have like something that you could write regular expressions to try and understand the actual survey. And at that point I was like, this is absurd. We have now reached, to take the XKCD panel on the right, we have now reached the point where we not only do we have a tool that needs a manual but doesn't have one, but we're actually at the point where we have a tool whose manual starts with how to use the manual. So I was like, we should move in the other direction and start distributing tools that actually just work, that don't really need the manual. And so the hope here was to be able to develop a set of functions that perform common tasks with the data. The goal, I was hoping to construct functions that are basically open source, so that someone who is new to the data can use them right away, but can also look back and say, did we keep these respondents? Did we drop these things? And actually look through it and make improvements. And the kind of the guiding principle here, which others may or may not agree with, is that the data should basically be left as is. So like once it's collected, it should be kind of stored and frozen, warts and all. So like all the different problems in it should be kept there, but we should have a consistent way of dealing with those problems so that it's always transparent. And so for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to go over a few, what I saw as a few likely use cases and some examples of these functions. The notion is that these should not necessarily be complicated. It's just a way of encoding all of our tacit knowledge in an immediate, easy to use format. And so that was kind of what I was hoping to do. So the main use cases I was going to go over are things like recoding and likely known data errors. So things like recodings are often in the code book, but people still have a tendency to miss them. Data errors are less likely to be in the documentation, for example. I was also going to cover subsetting criteria. So for example, when you need to know to drop the school that caught on fire, how would you include something like that? And merging criteria. So often data are distributed in multiple tables, which can be merged with each other. It's not always immediately obvious what columns they should be merged on and how well that match should actually work. So ideally, we would construct a function that would be able to do that. There are a couple of other use cases that I included in the paper. One is commonly used summaries. Here I'm thinking of things like, this is how we constructed wealth. We use so-and-so's code, and we've kind of got a standard way of doing that. Those are actually fairly commonly in use now as it is. So like, I want to say it's HRS that's distributed with like code that somebody at RAND produced about how to calculate wealth. And so I'm going to leave those out for the sake of this. And I'll cover briefly this idea of language-specific constructs. So R in particular is kind of, there are a lot of different object types which are kind of necessary to do different analyses, particularly for network analysis, which is what I do a lot in R. So you might want potentially to be able to adapt your code directly to those. So use case number one was the types of common recodings. So on the left, we have the types of things that we were trying to fix, and on the right, we have we have some sample code for how this might be done. So again, these can be quite simple. So often, for example, 999 is like missing. Basically, what we would do is we would have a function that says remove missing that would make sure to change all the 999s to a software appropriate missing value. And this seems like a trivial example, but the American Sociological Review back in like the late 70s published an article where someone forgot to recode the 999s into missing values, and actually that skewed the entire analysis. So this is not like, you know, it may seem trivial, but it's actually something that needs to be included. We basically want to make it idiot-proof to use the data. The other possible example was thinking of things like known errors. So, you know, for example, in administrative data, we might someone might have used Excel to copy and paste, and Excel helpfully attempted to autocorrect some value to like, you know, instead of being the same value across all the cells, it could autocorrect it to like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so ideally, you would construct something kind of like a load data function that would basically point to the file name and perform all of these recodings that you need to, that people who have that test knowledge would know to do, but people who are new to the data set might not already know. Similarly, I was thinking of kind of along the lines of a load data function for subsetting criteria. So again, like the school that catches on fire, or sometimes, you know, often we have, you know, or if we're looking at employees at a company, we might have employees on the one hand and contractors and temps on the other. Those might be, you know, basically if all the cases aren't alike, we might want to have some ability to automatically drop cases that are not usually analyzed together. And so again, I was thinking of this in terms of like kind of a load data function where we basically pull in the data and then drop cases that are not the same, essentially. The third use case that I had considered for this was thinking of merge criteria. So again, often we get data sets that are in multiple tables that we want to bring together. The merge criteria ideally would indicate which column would automatically basically identify the correct columns for these things to merge on, and then would spit out a result that says basically we kept all the rows of this, you know, X% of rows of this other thing matched into this. And so then you would be able to compare that against a value in the documentation and say like, okay, this is working correctly versus I have no idea. Like I got 60, you know, like I tried to do this merge, 60% of it matched. Who knows if that's actually right? So these were the kinds of things, these are the types of things that I had been thinking of for this type of function. The last use case was a little bit more R specific. It's kind of thinking about basically if we want to construct a network object out of particular data sets, you might need some additional code for that, and you'd probably want to kind of standardize it. Bringing this all together, I wanted to show you an example from a published paper that uses these types of functions. So the notion here is that we basically have the data stored. This is the Prosper survey. This is the one with the 637 ill-documented files in a big box folder. And so basically what you'd want to be able to do is say you have a list of network objects and a rectangular survey data object. Ideally, you'd want to bring in pieces of information from the survey onto the network objects so that then you could do some kind of network analysis with those. And so I basically constructed a couple of examples here. So the first, these basically are two nested functions. So the first function is this get prosper variables by network. So you basically feed it a network object and the survey file, and what it does is it goes through and finds the IDs from the network object that correspond to the survey and pulls out the appropriate variables. And then with the second function, which calls that first function, can call that first function, get the set of variables, and then assign them as a network attribute, which is kind of an R-specific data construct, and then return that network for you to do analysis. So hopefully this seems plausible to you. When I brought it up to others, they presented a couple of concerns. So there are there's one set of concerns that's relatively easily addressed, and those are around replicability and the propagation of errors. So one possibility, so the idea here is that we would have these functions that are kind of edited by users as they go along. You know, like when one user builds a function, ideally it would be shared with everybody else. But then that presents the problem that if I write a paper in 2015 and someone discovers a data error in 2016, modifies the function in 2017, using the same function would not reproduce the code, would not reproduce the results from my paper in 2015, right? So that you can probably solve with a good versioning policy. So basically, when the code changes its output, like you would want to increment the versions, and people would need to cite the versions whenever they go to publish something using these functions. The second type of concern is a concern with the propagation of errors. So if a function actually produces an error and people use it uncritically, they could basically continue to produce all the same errors in subsequent papers. I would actually argue that that's an argument in favor of using a common set of functions, because frankly, right now we're already probably producing errors. It's just that they're more distributed. So, you know, some people are making the errors and some people aren't, and we have no idea. So if we have a shared function, basically we can correct that. We can find, you know, it's easier to find that the error in that one shared function, and then we can correct all the erroneous papers on us. And this actually did happen in a real world example. There's, I believe the fMRI, there was like a bug in the code to analyze fMRI data. And so there were like hundreds of papers that had an error because of this bug, but they were able to fix it you know, they were basically able to fix all of these papers en masse because they could fix this one central function. The other concerns that are less easily addressed are around cost and adoption. So basically, it's kind of, you know, it's easy to look at this and say like, oh, this is a nice idea, but who's going to pay for it? And I think you know, I don't have a clear answer about how to do this. The hope is that people will find it rewarding to, we'll be able to kind of structure the incentives so that people will find it rewarding to, more rewarding to improve these functions and use them than to just kind of develop their own thing. But it does help to think about what the incentives and the problems are that produce this in the first place. And part of the problem here is that social scientists are often rewarded for publishing papers, not code. And as a result, they make code writing pay by learning a data set. That means learning the tacit knowledge about how the data are used and writing the code to analyze those data to keep all of that tacit knowledge. It's kind of an opportunity hoarding problem, really. So one potential solution is to kind of structure this as like one of these, you know, kind of like a copyleft situation where, you know, have the data distributors produce the first set of functions, and then when someone else uses the functions, they're obligated to share any changes share the code that they used and any changes that they made with the functions back with the data distributors and everybody else using the data. But I'm very open to suggestions about how to make this work better. There are, of course, other barriers to how that basically are creating this problem in the first place. You know, funders may not want to pay for maintaining this kind of social science data infrastructure. You know, on long-living projects, personnel and priorities may change, and of course, the technology and best practices change quite a bit over time. think, even the code that I wrote 5 years ago that I was just showing you, I would probably have written differently today, because there are different packages in R that are more standard now. And so all of these things are kind of areas where this could use some help thinking about how to basically get around some of these problems. I had thought that constructing this kind of living, breathing functions that kind of adapt with the technology over time, and with the needs of the user base, might be a good solution, but I'm very open to suggestions. So I don't know how we're doing on time, but that's kind of, I actually don't have any way of looking and seeing if anybody's raised their hand or anything. But yeah, I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, I think rather than trying to unmute people to ask their questions, if you could put your question in the chat room, and I will read it out to Jake on your behalf. So with that, are there any questions for Jake? Jake, I think I'll ask a question of my own. Sure. So I was intrigued in reading your paper that you talk really about the benefits that you've seen and the reasons why people should invest their time and energy into doing it in pretty compelling fashion. But then you also talk a bit about the costs that go along with it, and particularly the cost of time and benefit given all the other work that faculty often have to do. But this is a decision that you've made and you're doing for your own particular work. And I think one of the things that's going to lead to a culture change is not just sort of the stick, that you have to do this, but the carrots, and that you get benefits and results from having done so. So are there things that you needed in terms of support for developing this code and for investing your time in it? Are there things that the institution or funding agencies or others can do to make this an easier path to walk down, to reduce sort of the perception that the amount of work it would take is being prohibitive?
Yeah, so I think so building these for my own personal use, I found quite helpful, because then if I wanted to go back and do a quick analysis on the data, I didn't have to remember where like my data cleaning script was, or remember what like create a cleaned version of the data set that I had to remember where it was. I could just like write load data whatever, and it would run the appropriate file. So I found that was quite helpful. In terms of getting these more widely adopted, it would be very helpful to have like some formal mechanism for credit. So either like getting either having funding provided, or some kind of like citation mechanism, like either slapping a DOI on it or setting up a technical paper to go with it. That would have been helpful. And of course, it would be helpful to have everybody working on the project kind of invested. So like having leadership say, this is important, let's move towards doing this kind of thing, I think would be quite helpful. Actually, one of the things that's, so this actually came out of a workshop, the idea for this came out of a workshop called Software Engineering for Statisticians, which was a really cool idea, I thought, because we spend a lot of time writing code, and perhaps everyone else is very good at writing it, but I am not. So I thought it was really valuable to have people who do this for a living actually tell me what I was supposed to be doing right and wrong. And so, I think that kind of having that kind of workshop would also be, I think, quite helpful.
Great, thanks. We have another question from one of our attendees. Jake, do you find Git functionality is sufficient for version control for such function sharing within the research community?
Yeah, I have struggled to get other people to adopt this, and I've actually struggled to get even Git installed in the enclaves where the data usually live. So in some sense, like in an abstract sense, yeah, I think Git would be fine. In a practical sense, I haven't had much luck getting other people to use it. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Okay, Lars, go ahead. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I'm intrigued by Jake's notion of making more transparent, essentially, the data cleaning process of that. It's an open question, I think, Jake, about where to draw the boundary of where that happens. In the way that you've expounded it, these would be run essentially on user computers after they've obtained the raw data. And so there never exists a sort of well-designated clean data that you can access. Rather, that clean data gets redone in a replicable fashion on users' computers. But a different way of looking at that, and possibly abstracting from some of the issues about what software you want to implement that in, is to delegate that here's the best practice, here's the function that generated that best practice onto the data provider's data extraction tool or whatever, which are often quite proprietary, sometimes opaque about those data cleanings. That's the initiator. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that function needs to be devolved to the users. It can be just exposed and implemented in open tools at the data providers. So here's the raw data, here's our extract. Most people will use the clean extract because, hey, I trust you guys. But if you want to look into it, you can also redo it and modulate and figure out and identify bugs, et cetera, in that. So it might just as well be that this is easier to implement in a centralized fashion, but with much greater transparency. Have you come across that as well?
I think that's a great point. So yeah, to put this in perspective, I was developing this as a graduate student, and you don't really have the power to kind of say like, I'm going to distribute the data in such and such a way. But I think if you were a data provider, that would be a good way of handling this problem. Basically saying, I think you're right that it's a good question where we'd want to draw the line. So there's some, you could imagine that there are some decisions that researchers would likely want to make on their own, levels of aggregation or what have you. But there are some decisions that researchers probably shouldn't be making, like cleaning up known data errors is something that, like 99% of people shouldn't be doing. And so I think you're right that it might be a lot easier to kind of push that off onto the people doing the distribution. Yeah.
Just one quick question, Jake. You mentioned that other barriers present problems, including funders may not want to pay for maintaining social science data infrastructure.
Yeah.
Have you looked into existing social science infrastructure, including data repositories, and looking at using existing functionality or asking them to add functionality to support this?
So I have not made. So yeah, it's actually kind of funny presenting this with the ICPSR, which is one of the best data infrastructures in the world. So it's, like this is, I'm thinking of like, your typical, you've got 5 investigators putting everything in a box folder, versus like ICPSR, which actually does this professionally. But yeah, no, there's a limit to how much I've dug into like professional data infrastructures adoption of this. Yeah.
Okay, I'm not seeing anything. Oh, wait. Nope. I'm sorry. I'm not seeing anything come through. So I'd like to thank all our presenters today and to MIDAS for hosting this. As I mentioned, this is a part of a series. The next presentation in this series will take place on June 23rd from 2 to 3 p.m. And that'll be with Oliver Hay, who's an associate professor of microbiology and immunology at the University of Michigan, and Jie Song, a graduate student research assistant at ICPSR at the University of Michigan. And they'll present their work entitled C2 Metadata, Continuous Capture of Metadata for Statistical Data. So thank you all very much. And that'll do it for us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.